Hanli's expression instantly changed slightly upon hearing this voice, but before he had a chance to do anything, an enormous vortex suddenly appeared on the translucent wall of light. A burst of tremendous suction force erupted out of the vortex to envelop Hanli's entire body, and this burst of suction force was several times more formidable than on the previous occasions where Hanli had been sucked into the wall of light. However, in the next instant, the burst of suction force suddenly faded, and Hanli felt a sharp pain in his mind, following which he completely lost consciousness. Sometime later, Hanli returned to his senses in a rather disoriented fashion, and he looked around to discover that he was situated in a murky gray space, while down below was a barren, dark red plain that stretched as far as the eyes could see. The plain was completely devoid of vegetation, and above it was a glittering silver river that was flowing through the sky amid a burst of dull rumbling. Upon closer inspection, Hanli discovered that as opposed to water, what was flowing through the river were actually water droplet-like balls of light. Hanli was very surprised to see this, but he didn't immediately move. This instance of spiritual transmigration seemed to be different from the previous few occasions. There was a mysterious aura permeating throughout the entire surrounding environment, and he couldn't help but think of the eyes that had appeared on the heaven-controlling vial and the faint voice that he had heard in his mind. Those eyes weren't unfamiliar to him, as they belonged to the vial spirit of the heaven-controlling vial. As for the voice that he had heard, that had most likely come from the vial spirit. Hanli couldn't see the vial spirit anywhere nearby, nor could he make sense of what it had said, so he set the thought aside for now and began to examine his surroundings. All of a sudden, he noticed that unlike his previous spiritual transmigrations, he didn't seem to have possessed anyone. Instead, his bare soul was hovering mid-air. It appeared that all of this had been triggered by the golden ring formed by the 3 bursts of integrated time law powers, and it seemed to have reacted somehow with the heaven-controlling vial. With that in mind, Hanli swept his gaze over his surroundings once again, but didn't find anything of note over the boundless barren plain around him. After withdrawing his gaze, he began to approach the river in the sky, and from up close, he was able to see that the river was flowing from somewhere too far away for Hanli's eyes to reach, and there was no end to it in sight either. There were countless balls of light of different sizes flowing through the river, with some as large as millstones, while others were as tiny as grains of rice. Each of the balls of light contained a shimmering image, but they were flowing by too quickly for Hanli to be able to catch a clear glimpse of any of the images. The entire river was giving off an indescribable aura of mystique, and after staring at it in a transfixed fashion for some time, Hanli began carefully approaching the river again before peering into one of the larger water droplets that was passing by. This water droplet depicted an image of a yellow desert that was rapidly changing. After a brief hesitation, Hanli released his spiritual sense onto the water droplet in an attempt to catch a clear glimpse of the image on it. But right as he did this, the water droplet immediately began to glow brightly before releasing a burst of tremendous suction force. In the blink of an eye, Hanli's soul was sucked into the water droplet without being able to put up any resistance. His vision instantly faded, and only after an indeterminate period of time did he slowly return to his senses, upon which a slightly ragged voice tinged with a hint of lingering fear rang out from nearby. What a terrifying opponent that was! Even with the 5 of us joining forces, 3 of us were still killed. Another high-pitched voice rang out in response, and it was also sounding a little out of breath. That man had already reached the pinnacle of the 5th level of the spirit refinement technique, so he was bound to be an extremely formidable opponent. Those 3 were far too eager to claim the reward on his head, and they rushed in without any preparation like idiots. Having said that, it's a good thing that those 3 did rush in and weaken him. Otherwise, we wouldn't have been able to take him down. In any case, we suffered extremely heavy losses here. Will we be in trouble with our higher-ups? The first voice asked in a concerned manner. It'll be fine. Us Immortal envoys are always tasked with perilous missions, so some casualties here and there are inevitable. All we have to do is bring this man's head back to our higher-ups, and we'll surely be handsomely rewarded," the high-pitched voice replied in a gleeful fashion. Hanli's heart jolted slightly upon hearing this conversation, and he hurriedly restrained his own spiritual fluctuations, then began to inspect his surroundings in secret. Just like during the previous few spiritual transmigrations, he had possessed a corpse. The body belonged to a black-robed, middle-aged man with a head of disheveled, long hair and a long and thin face. Even though he was already dead, there was still a fierce look about his sharp facial features. At this moment, he was laying on a yellow desert, and countless huge craters had been blasted into the ground all around him. Plumes of dense smoke were billowing out of some of these craters, releasing an acrid sulfurous odor. It was clear that an intense battle had just taken place here not long ago. There were two men clad in suits of golden armor nearby, and the symbols on those suits of golden armor were precisely the insignia of the heavenly court. One of the armor-clad figures was a tall, elderly man with a tall nose and a pair of thin eyebrows, while the other one was a bald young man with a round face and a rotund frame. At this moment, both of them were looking rather pale, and the bald young man was looking particularly worse for wear, with blood trickling down from the corner of his lips and signs of damage on his suit of golden armor. Strewn over the ground further away were there more bodies clad in suits of golden armor. Hanli only briefly inspected his surroundings before immediately withdrawing his spiritual sense and directing it deeper into the mind of the body that he had possessed. Through that brief inspection of his surroundings, Hanli had determined that the two armor-clad men were both at the high zenith stage, and their cultivation bases were far superior to that of Gongshu Ju, indicating that they were at least at the mid-high zenith stage, perhaps even the late high zenith stage. Through their conversation, Hanli had learned that they were both immortal envoys of the heavenly court, and if they were to discover that another soul had appeared in this body, then they would be sure to kill it right away. His soul had been transmigrated to this place by the heaven-controlling vial, so he wasn't sure what the consequences of being killed here would be, but he wasn't keen on finding out. Right as Hanli's soul began to burrow deeper into the black-robed man's mind, a tremendous burst of heat suddenly surged forth before fusing into Hanli's soul. The burst of heat was a burst of enormous and extremely pure spiritual sense, and it quickly began to inflate Hanli's soul like a balloon. The burst of immense spiritual sense carried with it a series of memory fragments belonging to the black-robed man, and they also flooded into Hanli's mind. Perhaps Hanli's soul had already grown accustomed to all of this from the previous few instances of transmigration, but he was able to easily receive the black-robed man's memories without much pain or other adverse effects. Hanli's soul was able to easily harness these fragmented memories, but the burst of spiritual sense was too immense, and only a small portion of it had surged into Hanli's soul before full saturation was reached. The remaining spiritual sense swirled around Hanli's soul, forming a glittering and translucent white cloud that was rapidly revolving along an extremely profound trajectory. Hanli was ecstatic to see this. This burst of spiritual sense was far more powerful than his own, and this method of channeling spiritual sense was the exact method stipulated in the 5th level of the spirit refinement technique. Hanli had been arduously cultivating the 5th level of the spirit refinement technique over the years, but it had been far more difficult to grasp than he had anticipated, and even after toiling away for several centuries, not much progress had been made. As he felt this burst of spiritual sense swirling around him, he found solutions to many of the problems that had previously stumped him in his cultivation, and he was struck by a sense of enlightenment. However, given the current situation, he couldn't afford to immerse himself in all of this. His eyes abruptly sprang open as he swept a sleeve through the air, and a black flying sword shot out of the palm of his hand. As soon as the flying sword was released, it instantly vanished into thin air, immediately following which countless black sword projections emerged, forming a massive sword mountain that swept toward the pair of armor-clad men. There was no way that the two men would have failed to notice the eruption of spiritual sense from the black-robed man's mind, and sure enough, both of them turned to the body on the ground with astonished expressions before hurriedly darting back in retreat. However, in their panic, both of them had failed to notice that a streak of translucent light had shot out of Han Li's glabella before vanishing into thin air. "How are you still not dead?" the tall elderly man exclaimed in an incredulous voice as he made a grabbing motion with one hand, and countless blue ripples instantly surged out of the palm of his hand, forming a massive blue worm projection that swooped down toward the Black Sword Mountain. The giant blue worm wrapped its body around the Black Sword Mountain, then released a burst of formidable glacial power that instantly froze the entire surrounding space. The Black Sword Mountain was also frozen solid and drew to an abrupt halt as a thick layer of blue ice crystals appeared over its surface. As for the portly young man, there was a fearful look in his eyes. But he also sprang into action, sweeping a sleeve through the air to release a pair of crimson curved daggers, each of which was around 3 feet in length. Bursts of crimson flames were burning over the curved daggers, forming a series of fiery crimson flowers that were giving off a terrifying, scorching aura. The 2 curved daggers circled around in the air before hurtling directly toward Han Li as 2 streaks of crimson light. Right at this moment, Han Li thrust his hands into the ground, launching himself upward like a weightless sheet of paper, allowing him to just barely evade the 2 streaks of crimson light. At the same time, a faint smile appeared on his face as he abruptly made a hand seal, and several translucent chains shot out of thin air behind the tall elderly man before vanishing into his head in a flash. A horrified look appeared on the elderly man's face, yet before he had a chance to do anything, his eyes completely glazed over, while his body also became suspended in midair in a completely still manner. The sneak attack from Han Li had come far too abruptly and unexpectedly, and the elderly man was barely able to display any of his power before his soul was trapped within a spiritual sense cage.